The wind howled through Red Canyon like a banshee's wail, driving snow horizontally across the main street and piling it against the weathered storefronts. Sheriff Jake Morrison pulled his coat tighter as he made his evening rounds, the leather of his boots crunching through the fresh powder that had been falling since dawn. The town looked ghostly in the pale light filtering through the storm clouds, and most folks had the good sense to stay indoors by their fires. That's why the small figure huddled against the general store caught his attention immediately. Morrison approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving away from his gun belt. As he drew closer, he could see it was a child, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wrapped in what looked like a thin summer dress and a torn shawl. Her lips were blue with cold, and she was shaken so violently he could hear her teeth chattering from 5 feet away. "Hey there, little one," he said gently, crouching down to her level. "What are you doing out here in this weather?" The girl looked up at him with eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. Tears had frozen on her cheeks, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Mama died in the cold this morning. It's cold. We have nowhere to go. Please help us." Morrison felt his heart clench. "Us? Who else is with you, sweetheart?" She pointed a trembling finger toward the alley between the general store and the saloon. Morrison stood and followed her gesture, and there in the shadows he could make out another small form, a boy, even younger than the girl, curled up against a wooden crate. "Jesus," Morrison breathed, then caught himself. "Sorry, miss. Let's get you both somewhere warm right now." He scooped up the boy, who was barely conscious, and guided the girl toward the sheriff's office. The building was modest but sturdy, with a pot-bellied stove that Morrison kept burning through the winter months. As soon as they were inside, he wrapped both children in every blanket he could find and stoked the fire until it roared. "What are your names?" he asked, pulling up a chair close to the stove. "I'm Sarah," the girl said, her voice stronger now that she was warming up. "This is my brother Tommy. He's 5. "Sarah, I'm Sheriff Morrison, but you can call me Jake. Can you tell me what happened to your mother?" Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. "We've been traveling for weeks, trying to get to California where Mama said our uncle lives. But our horse died 2 days back, and we've been walking ever since. Mama got sick in the night, and this morning she wouldn't wake up no matter how much I shook her." Morrison poured hot coffee from the pot on his stove and handed her the cup. "Where is she now, Sarah?" "About a mile out of town, in a little cave we found. I tried to drag her here, but she's too heavy, and Tommy couldn't walk no more." The sheriff stood and grabbed his heavy coat. "I need to go take care of your mother, but I want you and Tommy to stay right here where it's warm. Mrs. Henderson next door runs the boarding house. I'll ask her to come sit with you." Sarah grabbed his sleeve with surprising strength. "You ain't gonna just leave us, are you? Promise me you won't leave us." Morrison knelt down and looked her straight in the eyes. "I promise you, Sarah, I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. Red Canyon takes care of its own." After arranging for Martha Henderson to watch the children, Morrison gathered Dr. Emmett Walsh and Undertaker Samuel Pierce for the grim task ahead. They found the mother exactly where Sarah had described, a young woman, probably not yet 30, frozen in the small cave that had provided their last shelter. Her arms were still wrapped around the tattered blanket that had covered her children. "Poor thing," Dr. Walsh murmured, examining the body. "Looks like pneumonia, probably brought on by exposure and exhaustion. She's been sick for days, I'd guess." Pierce shook his head sadly. No identification, no belongings to speak of. These folks were traveling light. Morrison studied the woman's face, peaceful now in death. She kept those kids alive as long as she could. That took real courage. They brought the body back to town as the storm intensified. By the time Morrison returned to his office, word had already spread through Red Canyon's small community. Martha Henderson had fed the children soup and bread, and several other townspeople had stopped by with clothes and offers of help. "Sheriff," Martha said as he stamped the snow off his boots, "these children are going to need somewhere to stay. The boarding house isn't really set up for young ones." Before Morrison could respond, the door opened and in walked Ezra Blackwood, Red Canyon's wealthiest rancher and most influential citizen. Blackwood was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. He commanded respect through a combination of wealth, political connections, and a reputation for ruthlessness when crossed. "Sheriff Morrison," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I understand we have a situation with some orphaned children." "That's right, Mr. Blackwood. Just trying to figure out the best way to help them." Blackwood's gaze fell on Sarah and Tommy, who instinctively moved closer to Morrison. "I've been thinking about this, and I believe I have a solution. My ranch always needs workers, and these children could earn their keep helping with chores around the place. It would give them food and shelter." Martha Henderson frowned. "Mr. Blackwood, they're just babies. The girl can't be more than 7 or 8. "Old enough to help in the kitchen and tend to simple tasks," Blackwood replied smoothly. "The frontier teaches children to be useful early. It's better than having them become a burden on the town's charity." Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd heard rumors about Blackwood's ranch, how the man had a way of acquiring workers who found it difficult to leave, how accidents seemed to happen to anyone who asked too many questions about working conditions. "That's generous of you, Mr. Blackwood," Morrison said carefully, "but I think the children need some time to grieve and recover before we make any permanent arrangements." Blackwood's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "Sheriff, you know as well as I do that this town can't afford to support 2 orphans indefinitely. My offer is practical and generous. The children would have work, food, and a roof over their heads." Sarah suddenly spoke up, her voice small but clear. "I don't want to go with him, Sheriff Jake. Please don't make us go." Blackwood's expression darkened. "Children don't always know what's best for them, Sheriff. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Morrison could feel the weight of Blackwood's influence. The man owned half the businesses in town and held mortgages on most of the rest. Crossing him could mean trouble for Morrison's position, maybe even for the whole town. But looking at Sarah's frightened face, Morrison made his choice. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm going to keep the children here for now while I look into other options. Maybe there are relatives we can contact." Blackwood stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled anger. "I see. Well, Sheriff, I hope you understand the position you're putting this town in. Resources are limited, especially in winter. I trust you'll reconsider when the reality of the situation becomes clear." After Blackwood left, Martha Henderson let out a breath she'd been holding. "Jake, you know he's not going to let this go. Ezra Blackwood doesn't like being told no." Morrison nodded grimly. "I know. But something about that man doesn't sit right with me. The way those kids reacted to him. You think there's something wrong with his ranch operation? I've heard whispers. Nothing I could prove in court, but enough to make me cautious. These children have been through enough. I'm not about to hand them over to someone who might make their lives worse." Martha began gathering her things. "What are you going to do with them tonight?" Morrison looked at Sarah and Tommy, who were finally showing some color in their cheeks. "They'll stay here. I've got a cot in the back room, and I can make a bed on the floor. Tomorrow, I'll start asking around, see if anyone knows of relatives, or if there's another family in town who might take them in." "And if Blackwood comes back?" Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens." After Martha left, Morrison helped the children settle in for the night. Sarah was quiet but alert, clearly trying to process everything that had happened. Tommy had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's ordeal. "Sheriff?" Sarah whispered as Morrison was banking the fire. "What is it, sweetheart? Why didn't you like that man? The one who wanted to take us to his ranch?" Morrison considered his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups get a feeling about people, Sarah. It's hard to explain, but I didn't get a good feeling about him. I think you and Tommy are safer here for now. Mama always said to trust people who are kind to animals and children," Sarah said softly. "That man didn't look at us like we were people. He looked at us like we were things." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought. If an 8-year-old could see through Blackwood that clearly, what did that say about the man's true nature? As the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Morrison found himself unable to sleep. He sat by the window, watching the snow pile up in the street, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. One thing was certain. Ezra Blackwood wouldn't give up easily. Men like him were accustomed to getting their way, and being challenged publicly would only make him more determined. Morrison checked his gun and made sure it was loaded. He had a feeling he was going to need it. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and somewhere out there in the darkness, Morrison sensed that bigger troubles were brewing. The arrival of 2 orphaned children had set something in motion that went far beyond simple charity. In a town like Red Canyon, where power and influence mattered more than justice, standing up to Ezra Blackwood meant taking a stand that could change everything. Morrison looked over at the sleeping children, innocent and vulnerable in their borrowed blankets, and strengthened his resolve. Whatever came next, he wouldn't let them down. Some things were worth fighting for, and protecting the helpless was what he'd sworn to do when he pinned on the badge, even if it meant taking on the most powerful man in 3 counties. The wind howled outside like a warning. Morrison woke before dawn to the sound of horses outside. Through the frost-covered window, he could see 3 riders in the gray pre-dawn light, their faces obscured by heavy coats and hats pulled low. They weren't moving like travelers seeking shelter. They had the purposeful manner of men on business. He quickly checked on Sarah and Tommy, who were still sleeping soundly, then grabbed his rifle and positioned himself by the window. The riders had dismounted and were examining the tracks in the snow around his office, talking in low voices he couldn't make out. One of them, a tall man in a black coat, approached the door, while the other 2 flanked the building. Morrison recognized the tactical formation. These weren't ordinary ranch hands. The knock came hard and insistent. "Sheriff Morrison, open up!" "We need to talk." Morrison cracked the door, keeping the rifle ready. "Little early for social calls, isn't it?" The man in black pushed back his hat, revealing a weathered face with cold, professional eyes. "Name's Dalton. I work for Mr. Blackwood. He sent us to collect those children." "Did he now?" Morrison kept his voice level. "And what makes him think he has any claim to them?" Dalton smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Blackwood has legal guardianship papers signed by Judge Hartwell yesterday evening. The children are to be remanded to his custody immediately." Morrison's blood ran cold. Judge Hartwell was known to be in Blackwood's pocket, but moving this fast meant the rancher had been planning something like this for a while. Those papers wouldn't happen to be dated before the children even arrived in town, would they? "The date ain't your concern, Sheriff. Your concern is following legal orders." Dalton's hand moved closer to his gun. "Now step aside and let us collect the children." "Not happening," Morrison said firmly. "Those papers might be legal, but they're not right. And until I've had a chance to examine them properly and contest them if necessary, those children stay under my protection." Dalton's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Morrison. Mr. Blackwood is a patient man, but his patience has limits. So does mine, Morrison replied. You want those children? You come back with proper papers and proper authority. Until then, get off my property. The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before Dalton nodded slowly. Have it your way, Sheriff. But understand, Mr. Blackwood always gets what he wants. Always. Morrison watched the three men mount up and ride away, noting how they split up at the edge of town instead of riding back toward Blackwood's ranch together. That meant they were planning something, probably setting up surveillance or preparing for another approach. "Sheriff Jake?" Sarah's small voice came from behind him.
Are we in trouble? Morrison turned to find her standing in the doorway to the back room, wrapped in a blanket and looking frightened. No, sweetheart, but some people are making things more complicated than they need to be. It's because of us, isn't it? Because we don't have anywhere to go. Morrison knelt down to her level. Sarah, I want you to listen to me carefully. What's happening isn't your fault or Tommy's fault. Sometimes adults make bad decisions and other adults have to stand up to them. That's what I'm doing. But what if that man comes back? What if he tries to take us anyway? It was a fair question, and Morrison decided she deserved an honest answer. Then I'll stop him. That's what sheriffs do. We protect people who need protecting. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then nodded solemnly. Mama said there are good people and bad people in the world, and you have to learn to tell the difference. She said good people help others even when it's hard. Your mama was a smart woman. She also said bad people sometimes have fancy clothes and nice manners, but you can see the meanness in their eyes if you look close enough. Morrison felt a chill of premonition. Did you see something in Mr. Blackwood's eyes, Sarah? Yes, she whispered. He looked at us the same way the wolves looked at our horse before it died, like we were just meat. Morrison stood and checked his guns again. If a child could see Blackwood's true nature that clearly, then his instincts about the man were probably right. The question now was what Blackwood would do next and how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted. The answer came sooner than expected. Around mid-morning, Dr. Walsh burst through the door looking agitated. "Jake, you need to know, Judge Hartwell is in town, and he's not alone. He's got 3 federal marshals with him, and they're asking questions about you." Morrison felt his stomach drop. Federal marshals? What's their interest in a local matter? That's what I wanted to know, so I did some asking around. Turns out there's been some complaints filed about your conduct as sheriff. Someone's claiming you're interfering with lawful custody proceedings and possibly harboring fugitives. Fugitives? They're 8 and 5 years old. I know that, and you know that, but apparently someone has convinced the federal boys that there's more to this story. They're saying the children might be witnesses to a crime, and that you're preventing proper authorities from questioning them. Morrison ran a hand through his hair. Blackwood was moving faster and more aggressively than he'd expected. What kind of crime? They're being vague about that, but the implication is that the children's mother might have been involved in something illegal and that they might have information about criminal associates. Sarah, who had been listening from the back room, suddenly appeared at Morrison's side. "That's not true. Mama never did anything wrong. We were just traveling to find Uncle William in California." Dr. Walsh looked at the girl with sympathy. "I believe you, child, but sometimes the truth gets twisted by people with their own agendas." Morrison made a quick decision. "Doc, I need you to do me a favor. Take Sarah and Tommy to Martha Henderson's boarding house and keep them there. Tell Martha to lock the doors and not let anyone in except you or me." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to have a conversation with these federal marshals and find out exactly what they think they know." Sarah grabbed Morrison's arm. "Don't let them take us, Sheriff Jake. Please don't let them take us." Morrison knelt down and took her small hands in his. "Sarah, I made you a promise, and I keep my promises. But I need you to be brave and do what Dr. Walsh tells you, okay? Can you do that for me?"
She nodded, though her eyes were still frightened. "Will you come get us when it's safe?" "As soon as I can, I promise." Morrison watched Dr. Walsh lead the children out the back door toward the boarding house, then began preparing for what he knew would be the fight of his life. He checked his weapons, reviewed his legal authority as sheriff, and tried to think of anyone who might be able to help him stand up to federal marshals backed by Blackwood's influence. The answer, when it came, was not encouraging. In a showdown between a small-town sheriff and federal law enforcement, the sheriff rarely won, especially when the other side had unlimited resources and political connections. But Morrison had something they didn't have. He was fighting for what was right, not what was profitable. And sometimes, in the American West, that had to be enough. The confrontation came an hour later. Judge Hartwell arrived with 3 federal marshals, just as Dr. Walsh had warned. They marched into Morrison's office like they owned the place, which, Morrison reflected grimly, they probably did. "Sheriff Morrison," Judge Hartwell said without preamble, "I understand you're harboring 2 children who are material witnesses in a federal investigation." Morrison stood behind his desk, hands resting casually near his guns. "And what investigation would that be, Your Honor?" One of the marshals, a lean man with a carefully waxed mustache, stepped forward. The children's mother was suspected of being involved with a gang of train robbers operating between here and California. We believe the children may have information about the gang's activities and planned operations. "That's interesting," Morrison said slowly, "because according to the children, their mother was a widow trying to get to California to find her brother. They've been traveling for weeks and living hand to mouth. Doesn't sound like the lifestyle of someone involved with train robbers." "Sometimes children don't know everything about their parents' activities," the marshal replied smoothly, "which is why we need to question them properly, away from local influences." Morrison caught the implication. Local influences meaning me? Judge Hartwell cleared his throat. "Sheriff, there have been complaints about your handling of this situation. It's been suggested that you're allowing personal feelings to interfere with your professional judgment." "And who made these complaints?" "That's not relevant. What matters is that federal law supersedes local authority in matters of interstate crime. I'm ordering you to turn the children over to Marshal Brennan immediately." Morrison studied the 3 marshals, noting the quality of their clothes, the cleanliness of their appearance, and the fact that none of them looked like they'd been riding hard on the trail of train robbers. "You boys wouldn't happen to be on Mr. Blackwood's payroll, would you?" Marshal Brennan's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Sheriff." "It's a serious situation, Marshal. 2 orphaned children show up in my town, and suddenly everyone wants to get their hands on them. Makes a man wonder what's really going on." "What's going on," Judge Hartwell said sternly, "is that you're interfering with federal law enforcement. I'm ordering you to produce the children immediately, or I'll hold you in contempt of court." Morrison felt the walls closing in around him. He could fight, but that would likely end with him dead or in federal prison, and the children would still end up with Blackwood. He could comply, knowing he was probably sending Sarah and Tommy to a fate worse than death, or he could try to find a third option. The third option came in the form of an unexpected voice from the doorway. "Gentlemen, I believe you're all operating under false pretenses." Everyone turned to see a woman standing in the entrance, tall, elegant, and completely out of place in Red Canyon's rough environment. She wore a traveling dress that had clearly cost more than most people in town made in a year, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "And you are?" Marshal Brennan demanded. "Catherine Morrison," she said, stepping into the room. "Mrs. Catherine Morrison, from the Denver office of the Territorial Marshal Service. I'm also this man's sister-in-law, and I'm here on official business." Morrison stared at her in shock. He'd never seen this woman before in his life, but something in her eyes told him to play along. "Official business?" Judge Hartwell asked suspiciously. Catherine reached into her purse and produced a set of official-looking documents. "I've been tracking the same train robbery case you gentlemen are supposedly investigating. However, my information indicates that the children's mother was not a criminal, but rather a witness who was fleeing the real perpetrators. Someone has been feeding you false information." She handed the papers to Marshal Brennan, who examined them with a frown. "These documents suggest the gang is actually operating out of this area, led by someone with significant local influence." Morrison began to understand what was happening. This mysterious woman, whoever she really was turning the tables on Blackwood's scheme. "Furthermore," Catherine continued, "I have reason to believe that certain local parties have been attempting to obtain custody of these children not for their protection, but to prevent them from identifying the real criminals." Judge Hartwell looked uncomfortable. "This is highly irregular. I was told these marshals had proper authority." Catherine smiled coldly. "Perhaps you should verify their credentials more carefully, Your Honor. Real federal marshals would have contacted the Territorial Marshal Service before conducting operations in this jurisdiction. The fact that they didn't suggests they may not be who they claim to be." The three marshals exchanged nervous glances. Morrison noticed that one of them was slowly reaching for his gun. "I think," Morrison said loudly, his own hand moving to his weapon, "we need to sort this out right here and now. Real federal marshals shouldn't mind having their credentials examined by a territorial marshal, should they?" The room erupted into chaos as the fake marshals went for their guns. Morrison dove behind his desk as bullets started flying, drawing his own weapon and returning fire. Catherine had somehow produced a small but deadly-looking pistol and was shooting with surprising accuracy. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the fake marshals were dead, and the third was wounded and trying to crawl toward the door. Judge Hartwell was cowering behind a chair, his earlier bluster completely gone. Morrison stood up cautiously, keeping his gun trained on the wounded man. "Now then, suppose you tell us who really sent you." The wounded man looked at his dead companions, then at Catherine's gun, and made the smart choice. "Blackwood," he gasped. "Ezra Blackwood hired us to get the children, said they were orphans and no one would miss them." And the train robbery story? All made up. Blackwood said he needed a legal way to get custody, so he paid the judge to issue papers and hired us to play federal marshals. Morrison looked at Judge Hartwell, who was looking distinctly pale. "Your Honor, I believe you have some explaining to do." But Judge Hartwell was already making his own calculations. "I was deceived," he said quickly. "Mr. Blackwood told me the children were in danger and needed protection. I had no idea he was planning to use them for illegal purposes." Catherine holstered her weapon with practiced ease. "Of course you didn't, Your Honor. Though I suspect a thorough investigation of your recent financial transactions might reveal some interesting patterns." Morrison was still trying to process everything that had happened. "Catherine, I need to know who you really are and why you're helping us." She smiled, and for the first time, it seemed genuine. "Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see Ezra Blackwood brought down. As for who I am," she paused dramatically, "let's just say I'm someone who doesn't like seeing children hurt." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Morrison looked out the window to see Blackwood himself riding down the main street with a dozen armed men. "Looks like the main event is about to begin," Catherine observed calmly. Morrison checked his weapons and prepared for what he knew would be the final confrontation. One way or another, this was going to end today. Blackwood and his men spread out across the street in front of the sheriff's office, their horses stamping nervously in the snow. The rancher himself sat his mount with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been seriously challenged. But Morrison could see the anger burning in his eyes. "Sheriff Morrison," Blackwood called out, I believe you have something that belongs to me." Morrison stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk, his rifle cradled in his arms. Catherine appeared beside him, having somehow acquired a Winchester from somewhere. "The only thing I have, Blackwood, is a couple of children who need protection from men like you. Those children are legally in my custody. I have the papers." "Funny thing about those papers," Morrison replied. "Turns out they were issued based on false information by a corrupt judge who's currently reconsidering his life choices. The federal marshals who were supposed to enforce them turned out to be hired guns. Amazing how things work out sometimes." Blackwood's facade of civilized respectability began to crack. "You're making a serious mistake, Sheriff. I own this town. I own the bank that holds the mortgages on half these buildings. I own the men who decide whether this town prospers or die. You can't fight me." "Maybe not," Morrison admitted. "But I can sure as hell try." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Morrison counted 12 men with Blackwood, all armed and looking like they knew how to use their weapons. Against him and Catherine, assuming she was really on his side, the odds were not encouraging. Then something unexpected happened. Dr. Walsh stepped out of his office across the street carrying an old army rifle. "Jake's right, Blackwood. Those children deserve better than whatever you had planned for them." Martha Henderson appeared on the steps of her boarding house, a shotgun in her hands. "Some things are more important than money, Ezra." One by one, other townspeople began emerging from buildings along the street. The blacksmith, the general store owner, even old Pete who ran the livery stable. All armed, all taking positions that made it clear whose side they were on. Blackwood looked around in disbelief. "You fools! Do you have any idea what you're doing? I can destroy this town." "Maybe," called out Sam Fletcher, the blacksmith, "but we've been letting you run things your way for too long. Time to remember what this country was built on." Morrison felt a surge of pride and hope. This was what the West was supposed to be about. Ordinary people standing up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. But he also knew that Blackwood wasn't going to back down easily. Men like him didn't get where they were by accepting defeat gracefully. "Last chance, Morrison," Blackwood snarled. "Hand over those children, and maybe some of these buildings will still be standing tomorrow." "Counteroffer," Morrison replied. "You and your boys ride out of town right now, and maybe I don't arrest you for conspiracy, kidnapping, and corruption of public officials." Blackwood's hand moved to his gun. "I don't think you understand the situation, Sheriff." "Actually, I think he understands it perfectly." The new voice came from the other end of the street. Morrison looked over to see a group of riders approaching, real federal marshals by the look of them, with official badges and the hard-bitten appearance of men who'd spent their lives chasing real criminals. The lead marshal rode up close enough to be heard clearly. "Ezra Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to kidnap." Blackwood stared at the marshals in shock. "This is impossible. I have connections. I have protection." Catherine stepped forward, and Morrison noticed she was now wearing a badge he hadn't seen before. "Your connections just ran out, Mr. Blackwood. It turns out the Territorial Marshal Service has been investigating your operations for months. The business with the children just gave us the excuse we needed to move openly." "You set me up," Blackwood said, his voice filled with disbelief and rage. "You set yourself up," Morrison corrected. "All we did was give you enough rope to hang yourself." The fight went out of Blackwood's men quickly once they realized they were facing real federal law enforcement. Within minutes, the street was filled with surrendering gunmen and the metallic sound of handcuffs clicking shut. As the marshals led Blackwood away, he turned back to Morrison with pure hatred in his eyes. "This isn't over, Sheriff. Men like me don't stay down long." "Maybe not," Morrison replied, "but men like these," he gestured to the townspeople still standing in the street, "don't stay quiet long either. Times are changing, Blackwood. You just didn't notice." After the excitement died down and the prisoners were secured, Morrison found himself standing in his office with Catherine and the children, who had been brought back from the boarding house as soon as it was safe. "So," he said to Catherine, "who are you really?" She smiled and showed him her badge properly for the first time. "Deputy Territorial Marshal Catherine Blake. I've been investigating Blackwood's operation for 6 months, trying to find a way to bring him down without getting half the territory's officials involved in the scandal. And the children? Pure coincidence, but a fortunate one. Blackwood's reaction to their arrival told us everything we needed to know about his character. When someone's willing to exploit orphaned children for personal gain, they'll do anything." Sarah looked up at Morrison with wide eyes. "Does this mean we're safe now? Really safe?" Morrison knelt down to her level. "It means you're safe from Mr. Blackwood. But we still need to figure out what's going to happen to you and Tommy in the long run." "Actually," Catherine said, "I may have a solution for that, too. In the course of my investigation, I had occasion to contact authorities in California. It turns out your Uncle William has been looking for you. Your mother wrote to him months ago, asking if she could bring you children to stay with him." Sarah's face lit up with the first real joy Morrison had seen from her. "Uncle William? Mama said he had a farm near Sacramento and that he always wanted children but never had any of his own." "That's right. He's been waiting for word from your mother and was getting worried when he didn't hear anything. When he learns what happened, I'm sure he'll want to come get you immediately." Tommy, who had been quietly taking everything in, suddenly spoke up. "Will Sheriff Jake come visit us?" Morrison felt his throat tighten. "If your uncle says it's okay, I'd like that very much." As the sun set over Red Canyon, painting the snow-covered street in shades of gold and crimson, Morrison reflected on how much had changed in just 2 days. The arrival of 2 frightened children had exposed corruption that had been festering in his town for years and brought down one of the most powerful men in the territory. More importantly, it had reminded him and everyone else what really mattered. Not money or influence or political connections, but the simple principle that good people stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. 3 weeks later, Morrison received a letter from California. Uncle William had indeed come for the children, and they were settling in well on his farm. Sarah had included a drawing of herself and Tommy with a tall man she'd labeled Uncle William and a shorter figure she'd labeled Sheriff Jake. At the bottom, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for keeping your promise." Morrison pinned the drawing to the wall of his office, where it served as a daily reminder of why he'd chosen to wear a badge in the first place. Outside his window, Red Canyon was already rebuilding and moving forward, freed from the shadow of Ezra Blackwood's influence. The West was still a hard place, full of dangers and uncertainties. But it was also a place where ordinary people could make extraordinary differences, where doing the right thing still mattered more than doing the profitable thing. And sometimes, when winter came to places like Red Canyon, the warmth of human kindness was enough to melt even the coldest hearts. Morrison smiled and went back to his paperwork, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he'd be ready to face them. After all, he'd made a promise to a frightened little girl, and he'd kept it. In the West, a man's word was still his bond.